As you can all see, I am totally comfortable with technology. It's just, first of all, I am so excited to have our first in-person meeting here in this church. I walked by this church. I have visited the cemetery many a time, even before we did this. So it was a real treat when Pastor Radmacher, Radmacher.
There you go.
Radmacher. I knew I wasn't going to do it right. Offered to do this program for us. I asked him to let me know what he wanted me to say, that it was okay for you guys to hear. And he said that he is a graduate of Duke University, and before coming to Crestwood, he was the pastor of John Street Church in Lower Manhattan, the oldest Methodist congregation in the country. He was there from 2003 to 2017. But what he didn't tell you is that he has been in love with history for a very long time, which is why we are so lucky that we sort of like opening up the door to a candy store and saying, so would you like to come in? And he said, yeah, I'd like to do that program. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. And welcome to Asbury Church. As Kurt said, I'm Reverend Jason Radmacher, pastor here at Asbury, and it really is a treat to be a part of an in-person gathering like this, also online today, but very, very thankful to have this opportunity. Let's just begin. In 1815, spring of 1815, a woman died and was laid to rest in the cemetery just outside the doors here. Abigail Sherwood was her name. She was 77 years old, and during her life, she had borne witness to an incredible transformation in not only this community, but really in this nation and in the world. She grew up on the Phillipsburg Manor estate, on the manor itself, in this neighborhood, it would seem. She bore witness to a revolution. She bore witness to the birth of a new nation. She bore witness to the birth of this church. And when she passed away, friends, family members, neighbors undoubtedly gathered to pay their respects. The stone that marks her grave deteriorated many, many years ago. It still stands, but it's unable to be read. In 1925, a transcription, though, was made, so we know what it said. In memory of Abigail, wife of Jeremiah Sherwood, who departed this life April 5th, 1815, in the 77th year of her age. Go home, my friends, and cease your tears. I must lie here till Christ appears. Repent your sins while time you have. There's no repentance in the grave. Abigail died 1 year before Francis Asbury, a man who had played a pivotal role in her life, with whom her and her family had developed a friendship, and obviously whose story would become intertwined with hers. The chapel that stood on this spot, next to where Abigail was laid to rest at the time of her death, was called Sherwood Chapel, now today Asbury Church. So we gather today to learn a little bit more about Abigail and about Francis Asbury. But since this is a story about a Methodist congregation, I have to take you back a little bit further and begin with the ministry of John Wesley. You can't tell a Methodist history story without talking about Wesley. So I'm going to give you all a crash course, Methodism 101. Here we go. John Wesley's born in the early 1700s in England. He comes of age, attends Oxford University, where he graduates and ultimately seeks orders to become a priest in the Church of England. At that time, though, Wesley becomes dissatisfied with not so much what the church is teaching, but how the adherents of the church are living. All right, so he goes on to be one of the pivotal figures in the last 300 years of Christian history, particularly among Protestants. But while some folks like Martin Luther make their mark by saying, hey, the church is teaching the wrong thing, and I can teach you and I know the better thing that the church should be teaching, Wesley's like, Church is basically teaching the right stuff. It's how those people are living that's really messed up. So that's where the energy of what becomes the Methodist revival takes shape. And we do speak of it that way, a Methodist revival, because its focus and its intention is on the change of life, change of living. That first takes shape in England, where Wesley lived. Although he did travel a great deal throughout England and into Ireland as well. Only made one trip to America early in his career. There's a lot of stories there. He came as a missionary to Georgia. He was an absolute failure as a missionary in Georgia. There's a lot of great stories about that, but that's a story for another day. The next time you come back, we can get into all that. But for our purposes today, it's worthwhile to know kind of how this movement spread. A Methodist preacher, Wesley or another, would go to a town, they would preach, persons would be stirred by that, and would continue to meet in a small group, at that time called a Methodist class. These would take place primarily in homes, really, in small gatherings. That movement, that sense of revival moving throughout communities, ultimately made its way to the American colonies. There seem to have been little fits and starts throughout the early American history. Actually, I found some notes here in Westchester where they're complaining about Methodists in the 1740s, which was news to me because that's not something that Methodist historians talk about. So whether that was just a kind of a rogue preacher stirring up trouble, I don't know. That's one of the question marks I have from this week, is what was going on there. But the real story here in New York begins in the 1760s when an Irish immigrant named Philip Embry, who had heard Wesley preach back in Ireland, gathers a group in his home in Lower Manhattan. That group begins to grow. It ultimately becomes John Street Methodist Church in Lower Manhattan to this day. But in 1768, that group that Embry was leading wrote a letter back to Wesley saying, here's what's happening here. This has taken root, we're growing, we're getting ready to build a chapel, and we could really use your help if you would send leaders, some preachers to kind of help us. That set in motion the events that ultimately led to Francis Asbury coming to America in 1771. Francis Asbury, our namesake, and some of you have already pieced together the namesake of Asbury Park on the Jersey Shore, of something around 200 churches named after him across this country, a really prolific figure, certainly in Methodist history and I think in American history too. He arrives in Philadelphia in 1771, late that fall, and ultimately quickly makes his way to New York. That's where our story kind of picks up, because he makes his first travels to this area in late November, early December. And he writes about that in his journal. I'll read from you now. The subtext of this is when Wesley arrives, he thought that the other preachers whom Wesley had sent liked the city far too much. And Wesley, it's a constant theme in his journal, that other preachers are too sedentary, and he wants them to be on the move, to be moving throughout the area. So this picks up with an entry on Saturday, December 8, 1771. As Brother Boardman was still in New York, Francis is not happy about that, I thought it would be best to make another visit to Westchester, to spend the evening. I spent the evening and lodged in the house of a Dr. White, who appears to be an understanding man in the things of God. His wife is also of an amiable disposition and is touched with a sense of her own state and that of her neighbors. This is very much what his journal, it's part travelogue, part inventory, like almost like psychologist records, right? He's keeping track of these people that he meets and how is it with their soul. That's kind of his main emphasis. I spoke to her freely of the willingness to Christ to save now, but unbelief still prevailed, he notes. The next morning, I went to the courthouse to preach, but the noise of the children and the ill behavior of the unhappy drunken keeper caused much confusion. In the afternoon, my friend informed me that the door of the courthouse was shut against me. I felt myself a little bit troubled, but soon after, a tavern keeper gave me the offer of an upper room in his house, where I spoke again. Going down, December 10, I rode to New Rochelle, and I was received with great kindness by Mr. Devereaux and his family. I preached there to a few. The next day, I also preached to a large company and found liberty and believed the power of God was among us. From these, I rode on to Rye, where a few people were collected together to hear the word, and the next day I preached to them again. Then I rode on to Eastchester, preached to a large company. I preached to a large company and found some satisfaction in speaking to them. The next day, the Lord's Day, I preached in New Rochelle again. I tell you this to give you a sense of his movements. That's the course of 2 days. And I think we have an example of him preaching in a couple of homes, a courthouse, a tavern, but you get the sense of Asbury's movement. He keeps that up for the next 50 years, all over the nation, really. You find spots on the other sides of the Appalachian Mountains where Asbury preached, and it's just this constant movement and organizing and preaching, just this prolific figure. The house that he found a welcoming audience and a place to stay here seems to have been the home of a man named Peter Bonnet. And it seems that Peter Bonnet's house was on modern-day Central Avenue, about a mile up. This is the record that I've found reference to, about a mile up from Underhill Road. So what's that? Probably up towards, I don't know, past McDonald's or around McDonald's, something like that. I don't know. But that home becomes the epicenter of Asbury's travels. When he comes to this area, that's where he kind of sets up shop. And Bonnet's home becomes the center of Methodist activity in this area. Now you can tell from those movements, you could go, we could give this lecture at the Methodist Church in Mamaroneck, or the Methodist Church in New Rochelle, and they could tell a similar story of Asbury's movements in their community, beginning with in a home and using that as a base to move about. And that's what happens. Asbury mentions Bonnet's home several times over the next few years, up until about 1774, where he talks about a few dozen people being part of that congregation. By the time we get to the mid-1770s, though, things are starting to get a little bit crazy in this area. And one of the real fascinating distinctions between Methodism and just life in Westchester and life in New York City and the Methodist Church in New York City as we enter into the time of the Revolution is just the nature of what every day was life. New York City is controlled by the British throughout the war, which gave a certain stability to the life of the Methodist congregation there. Life up here seems to have been far more chaotic. And as the war breaks out, very quickly things get very challenging for not only the little Methodist group meeting in Peter Bonnet's home, but of course throughout Westchester. It's an incredibly challenging time. We're going to come back to Asbury, but Asbury throughout the war, it impedes his ability to travel in this area greatly. So his story kind of takes a southern shift into the Revolutionary time. Just some interesting notes on his time there. He was a pacifist, which during the Revolutionary War meant that he basically ticked everybody off. Everybody was mad at Francis Asbury. He wouldn't join the Patriot cause, so they weren't pleased with him. And the Tories weren't pleased with him because even though he was born in England, he wasn't willing to sign on and fight for their cause as well. So he ends up actually hiding in a barn for a long period of time in Delaware, I think. So again, a whole other story of Francis Asbury's life during the Revolution. But here in our little corner of Westchester, here's some of the things that we can piece together from what life was like for our congregation. This is the neutral zone, right? The line between the British-held territory, modern-day Bronx and further down, and the Patriot line, which further north, right, like northern Westchester and points beyond. So our area of Westchester is a neutral zone, a no man's land, which seems to have been a really hellish place to live. This book, Revolution on the Hudson, gives us a little flavor of what life was like. And I admit, this was a history that I was not aware of until I started getting ready to give this lecture. Never recalled reading this in any of my Revolutionary War history books growing up. Westchester County was a special case. Its people remained evenly divided politically as they had been before the war. They fell into a destructive civil war that could not extricate themselves from. On and on it went, the circle of violence increasing year after bloody year. Running through the country from Long Island to the Hudson was a 30-mile wide strip of land called the Neutral Ground, situated between the American Army to the north and the British to the south. Its boundaries extended roughly from north of Morrisania to the mouth of the Croton River. Fighting between irregulars raged in the God-forsaken territory, neighbor against neighbor throughout the wider war and beyond. James Delancey's refugees were infamous for their brutal treatment of patriots or anyone they chose to label a rebel. Often they used the word Skinners to identify their victims. Other so-called loyalists known as cowboys were also active, robbing, raping, and pillaging. Organized groups of rebels fought back as the carnage continued year after year. This is such a different and eye-opening perspective on this place during the war, rather than thinking of George Washington moving his troops from here or there, General Howe countering, and that kind of strategic war. It really brings it home to a real horrible situation where everyone was suspect and everyone seems to have been living with a level of fear, including some of the folks buried in our cemetery today. I came across this in my research. It's the remembrance of a man named Joseph Levines, who ultimately married a daughter of the Sherwood family. So I guess he's Abigail Sherwood's brother or son-in-law. But his story was recorded in during research. I found a reference to the famous McDonald papers. And I'm like, what on earth are the McDonald papers, right? And how are they, if they're so famous, how I've not heard of that? It seems to be a remarkable resource if you're interested. An 1845 oral history of something like 200 residents of Westchester County, their memories from the war. And I believe that is I think you can find that. I see some heads nodding. So for those of you who are skilled researchers, I don't know if it's been published and how accessible it is. But what an incredible treasure trove of information this is. First-hand oral history from the people who lived through the Revolutionary War. This is Joseph Levine's recollection as recounted by his granddaughter. My grandfather's sister told me around 1920, the story was told to her, that when she was in her 90s and had a good memory, that she personally was told by Joseph Levines that his experiences in the war were most harrowing due to the raids of the Skinners and the cowboys. He also said almost everyone was suspect, including his uncle, but that the latter was completely vindicated of the charges of giving aid and comfort to the enemy, the Tories, for after the war, he was awarded a farm in St. Lawrence County and given a pension. Interestingly enough, the Levines had a farm after the war on Old Army Road, and then ultimately lived on Fort Hill Road. So pictures in the neighborhood. But it captures that sense of chaos where the Skinners and the cowboys could both cause trouble for you. It's not like your political allegiance, gave you security with one group. These are kind of just roving bands who anyone could take your stuff or kind of bring havoc to your family. And it reminds us of what these folks lived through and what they endured. Again, a part of the story that often gets lost. Well, another pivotal moment that takes place in our immediate area here at Crestwood is because the Phillips family were loyalists, and the whole Phillipsburg Manor then was the property of that loyalist family. It was taken from them, right, and parceled out and put on public auction, right. The Sherwoods were one of the families who bought up the land that they had been farming as tenants, becoming the owners. The Sherwood farm, actually, you can almost see it from right where I'm standing. I'm sure you could. Their property ran along the east side of Scarsdale Road, right? So right here, again, like right here, I could probably have seen their house where Scarsdale Road and Pennsylvania Avenue meet. That was the Sherwood farm, and their house was very close to what would have been that intersection. They purchased that land and continued then as landowners. Putting it back in the context of the big Methodist story, I told you John Wesley and the Methodist movement began as a revival in the Church of England. When America gains its independence from England, that presents a big challenge for the Methodists here in the new country, right? Created some big problems for those who would become members of the Episcopalian Church in this country too. But the Methodist way of solving that was to actually make plans to formally separate and become a denomination. That happened in 1784. But that provides an important context for those early years, and it's a part of the story that even Methodists don't quite get, don't understand a lot, is that in those early years, there's no conflict in saying, I'm a Methodist, but I go to the Presbyterian Church. Or I'm a Methodist, I go to the Lutheran Church. There was this sense that Methodism was, again, this revival movement that might be your small group meeting during the week, but on a Sunday morning, for your baptisms and your Holy Eucharist and those kind of activities, you would go to an established church. And actually, we saw this in Manhattan, and I'm sure it was true up here. As these little groups, as these Methodist congregations start to take shape, they never schedule anything on Sunday morning, because that would have been in conflict with the established churches. When Asbury's talking about preaching on a Sunday, that's a Sunday evening, a Sunday afternoon. But that changes in 1784. The Methodists in this country organize themselves and become the Methodist Episcopal Church. That's the first name that the Methodists in this country take. Asbury gets appointed as, in Wesley's words, as general superintendent. Asbury is going to be in charge of Methodism in America. Here's an interesting little tidbit of how the American ideals had started to influence Methodist thinking, though. The orders come from England that John Wesley says Francis Asbury is going to be the leader, the general superintendent of Methodism in America. And the Methodists in America say, we're going to vote on that. And then they said, yeah, Francis Asbury is going to be our general superintendent. But just that subtle difference, like no one in England is going to send us orders of what we're going to do. We're going to affirm it by the consent of the people, right? It gives us a sense of how that those ideas had began to shape the people here. All along the while, Asbury continues his movements, just traveling, just going, and makes another journey back here in 1797 that is really quite wonderful, and it's something I want to dig into a little bit. He comes here in 1797, and at that point says he stays at the home of the widow Sherwood. He stays at Abigail Sherwood's house. again, just down the corner here. And he reports with great enthusiasm that that little congregation that he had visited and been a part of creating more than 20 years earlier was now in the process of building their own little chapel for gathering. And that was the original chapel that stood on this house. They dedicated on this ground. That chapel was dedicated on Christmas Day, 1797. And I think some of you know that chapel still stands. It's across the street. It was picked up in the 1860s and moved and has been a private home since that time. But you can still see the original 1797 Methodist chapel, originally called Sherwood Chapel, just a move across the street from where we are. Asbury, during that visit, was quite ill. And actually, it ended up becoming an extended stay here in Crestwood, in the Sherwood home, because of this illness. And that leads to, I think, one of the really, it's really a beautiful moment. It's one of the reasons why I really find this kind of research fascinating. After being here in 1797, he comes back in 1800. And at that point, obviously they had dedicated the church. But the tragedy had come to the Sherwood family. And he makes reference to it in his journal. This is from June of 1800. He's back in the area and he says, "We rode 26 miles to my old home at the widow Sherwood's. But my dear Betsy Sherwood, my nurse, is gone, I trust to glory." Elizabeth Sherwood was Abigail's daughter-in-law. And in late 1799, she gave birth, and the child died quickly. The child was named Sylvester. And Betsy Sherwood died the following month. Those are the two oldest marked graves that we have in our cemetery. Sylvester Sherwood, 1799, and his mother, Elizabeth Betsy, in January 1800. And there, again, I think this is the power of this kind of storytelling in history. Francis Asbury, this figure with towns and churches named after him, you can read about him in all sorts of history books and his influence in this early country's history. It comes down to a story of a family that he had become friends with and their tragedy and how that touched him. And I think that's the power of a cemetery like Asbury's. I'm not holding on to any big secrets here. I'm not going to tell you there's some great general buried out there or some great politician or anything like that. It's basically families of farmers and the people who saw the transition from a farming area to a suburban area. That's who's out there. And their families and friends are the ones who gathered out there to remember them and grieve them. And that included someone like Francis Asbury, this prolific figure, and how that story would touch him. And those two stones are the stones that are out there, and you can see them, are not the originals. They were replaced, but that's the oldest marked grave that we have, Sylvester Sherwood, 1799, in our cemetery. But the faith and the vitality of the Sherwood family continues, and that led to another great moment in their history in 1806. And this is something I just came across in this research again. And her farm hosted a Methodist camp meeting. Now, you might be wondering, what is that, just like we get together and we pray? Well, yeah, you get together and you pray on a huge scale. These Methodist camp meetings were, part prayer meeting, part traveling circus, right? It's this huge scale event. Let me read you a little bit about the prayer meeting about the camp meeting that would have taken place right. I'm sure you could have heard it from where we're standing today. In May 1806, On Abby Sherwood's farm, Asbury notes that between 80 and 100 members of the church were present, members of this congregation. Around 1,000 Methodists and some presumed around 6,000 souls were on the grounds at different times. We watched, we cleared the ground, we fixed the seats, we built the stands, we erected a marquee for the preachers. Provisions, Asbury said, came in from both town and country. People came with their tents and baggage, weary from walking from at least as far away as Brooklyn. Asbury preached on the Sunday. We kept up the exercise of singing and prayer through the day and far into the night. We had great order and great power from the beginning to the end. It concludes, Asbury writes, I judge 200 souls were made the subjects of grace and its various operations of conviction, conversion, sanctification, and reclamation. Glory to God, glory to God, and to the Methodist of Turkey Hoa, which what he referred to Tuckahoe as in his journal. Again, it's hard to grasp the spectacle of these meetings, but when I came across that, I remembered that I had a book that had a picture of a Methodist camp meeting on the cover. So I'm going to pass that around just so you can get a sense of this event taking place here on the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and Scarsdale Road in Crestwood. 6,000 people gathering for 3 days of preaching and singing, a wild scene. Well, the story goes on, and as I said, Abigail Sherwood died in 1815. Francis Asbury died in 1816. Just to kind of fill in a little bit of the blanks, as I mentioned, that original chapel, Sherwood Chapel, stood on this spot until the 1860s, when it was picked up, moved across the street, and the original stone church was built on this site. Never torn down completely, just added to and expanded. So the core of where we are right now is that original 1866 building that's just been added to throughout the years. But I wanted to wrap up before we move to the Q&A with remarks about Bishop Asbury. We began with the very simple remembrance of Abby. Let me find my notes here. And of course, because of Asbury's travels, he became incredibly well known in the early American scene. And there are some great legends about him. One legend is that as much as he was traveling, you could send a letter from England just addressed Francis Asbury, North America, and he would get that letter wherever he was. And because he traveled so much, it is said that his face was more recognized than George Washington's in early America, because he was just on the go so much. But I wanted to conclude with this remembrance of Asbury, made by President Calvin Coolidge at the address of the unveiling of the statue to Bishop Francis Asbury in Washington, D.C., October 1924. Perhaps, too, there is a lesson in contentment in the life of this devout man. He never had any of the luxuries of this life. Even its conveniences did not reach him, and of its absolute necessaries, he had a scanty share. Without ever having the enjoyment of a real home, constantly on the move, poorly clad, often wretchedly sheltered, much of the time insufficiently nourished, yet his great spirit pressed on to the end, always toward the mark of his high calling. His recompense was not in the things of the earth, yet who can doubt that as he beheld his handiwork, as he saw his accomplishments grow, there came to him a glorious satisfaction and a divine peace. No doubt he valued the material things of this life, and certainly they ought to be valued and valued greatly, but he regarded it as his work to put a greater emphasis on the things of the Spirit. He sought to prepare men for the sure maintenance and the proper enjoyment of liberty, and for the more certain production of the better use of wealth by inspiring them with a reverence for the moral values of life. What a wonderful experience he must have had, this prophet of the wilderness. Who shall say where his influence, written upon the immortal souls of men, shall end? And certainly it did not end here in Crestwood. The generation who grew up hearing Asbury, taking leadership from him, we see what we do as direct descendants. And obviously, in time, the name of Sherwood Chapel was changed to Asbury Methodist Church, and we claim him as our namesake and our first pastor to this day. I want to give you time to ask questions now, knowing that I've just kind of put a lot out there, but I'm certainly happy to do the best I can to answer anything that you might ask. David?
I think it's interesting that Asbury didn't seem to take sides during the Revolutionary War when, of course, Wesley was on the side of the British, and this didn't seem to cause a schism in their relationship. So kind of not letting political differences divide is a lesson that would be good for Methodists to learn and for all of us to learn.
I mean, I'm fascinated by that. I mean, the truth in this area, I don't know what the politics were for some of the early families here. There becomes part of the challenge in learning those histories is that when Methodists first start writing their history down in this country, 1830s, 40s, and by that time you have a vested interest in telling everyone how your ancestors were very patriotic, right? So it's kind of hard to unpeel some of the layers there. I don't know enough from what I came across here, but I'm confident that at least some of the early people that Asbury spoke to in those early visits, 1771, were Tories, undoubtedly. They were in favor of remaining loyal. But yeah, Asbury just kind of throws his lot in with the reality on the ground that this is going to become a new country. And he does seem, you're absolutely right, to have placed the people before politics. I think that's a fair statement for sure. Yep.
Hi, I'm a neighbor from Greenville, and we're affiliated with the Greenville Church and Cemetery, so a lot of our families are related to a lot of your families. We have a continuum up along this side of the river, and what we found is with our group of people that include Underhills, Sherwoods, Levinuses, etc., that the people who were the landholders were forced to be loyalists. They were forced to sign by local people, and then they had to recant that. All of their kids were basically Tories. So the families were divided, but they were trained to keep their hands on their properties, depending on what happened.
Yeah, and I think that the whole conflict with this being the neutral ground and the Cowboys and the Skinners, I mean, I'm sure there was a lot of wisdom in trying to figure out which way the wind was blowing. And your answer, when pressed, I'm sure could change from day to day depending on which group was harassing you, right? When you're trying to save your family from really horrific circumstances, I'm sure. And again, that's part of the challenge. I will say one of the Underhills in the cemetery, in our church stories, he's recorded and remembered as a patriot, a member of the Westchester militia. I got into some family research from that someone was doing on the Underhill family, and they talk about him being present to protest against independence. Now, is one of those right? Is one of those wrong? Or are both those facts true, and there's just a thread that connects them that we don't quite see so clearly, right? So interesting stuff, for sure. Yes?
Are you familiar with the Sherwood House on Tuckahoe Road?
I am familiar. I've not been in it, but I'm
Yeah.
yes.
Are the Sherwoods here at all related to the Sherwoods? That house is preserved by the Yonkers Historical Society.
Yeah. I think so. I would, yeah, you know, I'm a Methodist preacher, I can't bet, but I'd bet so. I'm trying to piece together the family tree to see how that
I
works.
just want to share with you some information. Captain Samuel Crawford was a Methodist, and he was mortally wounded on March 16, 1777. As you go up Winter Hill Road on the way to the Post Road, there's a plaque to Samuel Crawford. And his son, Jonathan, was in the militia, the Patriot militia, and after his father was wounded and died, he became a Methodist minister, and he ended up his last years, 90 years old, as a Methodist minister in Saugerties, New York. So it's just like with enslaved people. You have to trace each one of their stories and then collectively come up. But I want to thank you for the great presentation. I learned a lot today.
Thank you. I would say, you know, I think when you mentioned about having to trace these individuals, I do think one of the really interesting, I mean, obviously the internet makes this kind of, you know, it's so faceted. It's a great time to be alive and be interested in this kind of stuff, right? Because you can track things down. But I'm finding for these kind of stories, honestly, a lot of like what Asbury Church was interested in preserving is to tell you, all right, in 1800, here's the list of our board members. Well, that's great, but do you care? But, you know, as family members, as descendants of those people start doing genealogical research, they're interested in that little bit, but they're also interested in telling you this oral history about granddad getting chased around by the cowboys, right? So, you know, you get some more color and family remembrances, you know, and so, yeah, and there are a lot of Methodist preachers on family trees, that's for sure. Right, where's the microphone? Oh, yes, yeah. Okay. Where was it? No, their property and her house would have stood on Scarsdale Road. As you're going, like as you leave here and are going down Scarsdale Road, it would have been on the right-hand side. But the original house is gone. Sherwood Chapel, the original 1797 chapel built on this site, that was picked up and that still stands directly across the street. It's a private house, yeah, private property. But that's the original 1797 chapel, yeah.
That Sherwood House was moved to it's on Carpenter now. What was the Sherwood House?
Yeah?
It was moved at some point. But my question has to do with the first and second Great Awakening seem to be, well, Reverend Asbury seems to be like halfway between the two Great Awakenings, but I wonder how they affected the evolution of the Methodist movement.
I mean, quite significantly. My theory on those early Methodists that I heard about from the 1740s, I'm going to bet that's probably stuff related to George Whitefield, who's this prolific preacher, comes to America, gathers huge crowds, and was very emotive in his preaching. He was one of those preachers that people would call a frustrated actor, right? Because, you know, weeping but powerful and drawing huge numbers. It's interesting. Whitefield's influence on both Wesley and I think on Asbury, just collectively, is pushing them and them following his example to be more mobile. You know, Wesley, back in England, it's the scandalous transformation in his life where he resolves that he's not going to limit his preaching just to consecrated churches. That he's actually going to preach outside. And of course, you might think, well, how scandalous is that? When he talks about that, he says, I resolve to be more vulgar, right? This is such a big thing, right? He's going to go out and preach outside. Same with Methodism taking shape here. And the camp meetings are a part of it, but also, as evidence from Asbury's travel, taverns and homes and courthouses, and then these huge gatherings of people. It's really, I mean, you can almost, I'm sure you can make some connections. It's kind of like the birth of mass communication, right? It's not just how many people can you gather under one roof, but these huge gatherings of people. So, and then I think in a more theological or spiritual way, I mean, the big emphasis again is on this transformation, this inner transformation. I think that's kind of Great Awakening language. It becomes a major part of American religious life. That sense of an inner transformation, not just adherence to a ritual or a dogma, but a changed life. And it's no mistake that also grows up. These events are all growing up alongside the country, where the ideals of liberty and freedom, yes, there's law, but we're talking about transformation of hearts and minds in a way too. So.
We have a two-part question coming in from the Zoom audience. It says, which home exactly is the old chapel? And isn't the John Street Methodist Church the one that is also the starting place of the AME Church?
AME Zion Church. The John Street Church in Lower Manhattan is the birth from that congregation because of racist practices in that congregation and in the denomination itself. A group of African American members of that church broke away and became the congregation known as Mother Zion Church, which is still around today. And in time, that became the AME Zion denomination in 1796 is when that happened. It's my understanding the house is right here across from the cemetery. I wanted to say another little interesting about the politics. Again, I don't know if it's the case up here, but one of my favorite little tidbits from the history at John Street is they have the list of everyone who donated money in 1768 to purchase that land. And it's a wild list. It's great. But on that list, there are two important people. One of them is a man named Isaac Sears, who is a rabble-rousing son of liberty, ends up basically being a privateer off the coast of Massachusetts during the Revolution, basically a pirate. And then on the person who made the largest donation to the church and Wesley Chapel there in New York was Captain Thomas Webb, who was a British officer who, during the Revolutionary War, actually gets arrested for being a spy. Doesn't seem to have been accurate. His wife actually pleaded to General Washington himself to get Captain Webb out of jail. So I love this idea that you could have a pirate and a spy on opposite sides of a conflict, finding some kind of common ground in a Methodist congregation. But Spies and Pirates, I had a great sermon called Spies and Pirates based on that story. But now, Ruth, you had a question? Mm-hmm.
Crestwood Church up the hill. And I love walking through their cemetery also. There are underhills up there and there are underhills down here. Do you know anything about that? In my mind, there must have been a family feud or I don't know.
I think they were just huge families. That's my general sense of it. I think the underhills especially, although you have some insights on that?
It's a huge family, and they were all over the map, but the British refused, they basically ordered people not to go to any church except the Church of England, an English church, and the Dutch church was given a pass. So if you went to any other church, you had to go to an English church, you had to pay to go to the English church, you had to pay to be buried in an English graveyard, and people got really angry about that, and the Underhills that we knew about going back into Long Island broke from the church and started burying themselves in their own graveyards on their own land. So, and our Underhills donated the land after the Revolution to create a Dutch Reformed church. But there was like this big pent-up thing in Westchester where, according to the history of Westchester County's religious stuff, there was like this big pent-up like desire for freedom to worship.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's, I think, why you see some Episcopal burials under hills and then others that seem to be renegades.
Now, one of the interesting things about that I came across is that when this land was given or sold to the church or for the building of the chapel, that they were offered, do you want the land at the bottom of the hill or the land at the top of the hill? And this congregation took this land, and St. John's went on the top of the hill. I thought that was an interesting little tidbit. But the restrictions on worship, of course, this is more frontier up here, but in the city, that was very profound, where, you know, if you weren't Church of England, you were pretty much either turned into a stable or a barracks or something to that effect. Methodists in the city were allowed to continue holding services in their chapel. They did, the one requirement they had to do was they had to provide services. They had to allow the German Hessian troops to hold services there as well. And of course, the come around here is I wonder if any of those Hessians who were worshiping down there were up here causing hell, because the Hessians were a major source of headaches up here, right? So it's an interesting going back and forth. Other questions?
Pastor, you did a wonderful job, and
Thank you.
You did allude in the beginning that you learned something from the research that you did to prepare for yourself. What was your personal most profound takeaway that you have from what you did to prepare for today?
I mean, honestly, it was the whole understanding of, and the beginnings of trying to put together the concept of this part of Westchester being that neutral ground, and what life must have been like that. I mean, I think my ignorance beforehand was very much one of, there are lines, when you study the Revolution, like when you're a kid, you just follow General Washington, right? Or the big battles. And you don't think about, well, what was going on between the battles? What was going on between the lines? So that was by far the biggest eye-opener, especially when I'm thinking of it in terms of, the genesis of this whole project was, let's look at these families. Who are these families? Who are these people buried in this cemetery? And one of the things that this church has always kept out is the list of who's buried in our cemetery who was alive during the Revolution. And, it's just this little list, and you don't think, but then when you start adding that kind of knowledge to the situation and know what was life like here, and you just start piecing that together and seeing how frightening it must have been at times, and what they had to face. That's the most eye-opening and interesting, and probably the thing I'm really fascinated by coming across that oral history, the MacDonald papers or whatever, and learning what some of those firsthand accounts might be of the people who lived in this part of Westchester at that time. I think that's fascinating stuff. Yep.
Pastor, I had a question. You mentioned Asbury Park, and that made me think of Ocean Grove and Pacific Grove. So that was in the camp. So that was all related to Asbury. I didn't realize that.
Asbury Park, and then Ocean Grove, the tiny little, that started as a camp meeting place, right?
I've been there. It's lovely. Thank you.
And the big tabernacle, right, at Ocean Grove, 10,000 people or whatever it seats. The origins of that are very similar to that picture of that book cover that I just passed around. These people gathering around and just days of intense, they're preaching for conversion, right? I mean, I'm sure those are wild scenes for sure. Yes. Anything else? I do want to say given the fragility of our cemetery, we all can't go out walking through it together. I don't think that would be a fun experience for any of us. But the cemetery is open, right? So you are able to visit it and to look at it. But I would like to go out there, and I can at least show you where Abigail Sherwood is, where Sylvester and his mother are buried. We can do that before we leave here today too.
So before we do that,
Yep.
I think we can all agree, what a wonderful presentation. And having worked at an historical society for over 20 years, isn't it wonderful to hear about it in the place where it happened? There is something about the power of place. And it just really, I mean, to be able to say, and if you look right out that window, I mean, that's just, and to invite you out and say, well, we're not going to walk around, but I do invite you to take a walk someday and walk through that cemetery. It's not overwhelming. It's not as though it goes on for miles and miles. It's this little cemetery, and it's really, really quite wonderful. So I want to say thank you again. It was just a great treat, I think, for all of us.
Oh,
and
thank
for
you so
our
much.
first in-person, our next one is going to be, and if you are on the mailing list, you'll be put on an e-blast so that you will get information, but it's going to be on September 17th, and it's going to explore Eastchester and its history during the American Revolution. So it is going to be yet another special treat. It will not be here. It will be back at our beloved library, the Crestwood Library. So look for that information coming to you via technology. What can we say?
Great. And just so you all know, this has been recorded, will be available online. We'll work out the details, but it'll be able to be shared and viewed again. Fact-checked, I suppose, would be a possibility as well. But as we get ready to move out to the cemetery, I'm going to invite you to either go out the center aisle here. There are a few steps if you go that way, or you can go out and around this way without any steps, whichever is easier to you. I'm going to ask you not to go out that side door just because it's a little, it's old. But let's make our movements there. Go out this door, turn to the left, or go out this way and come around, and then I'll orient you to where some of these stones are that we've talked about as well. All right, great. So we'll begin our way, and I'll see you out there.